Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 28 in my ongoing series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. My intention is that to the extent possible, each episode in this series will stand on its own, while also adding to the overall story of the series. In this case, I think your listening experience with this episode will be greatly enhanced if at the very least you go listen to episodes 25 through 27, where I cover the background of the Soviet-Afghan War. Those episodes and all other episodes in this series are available to go back and listen to in the same place you found this one. Last time, on the History Sphere, I covered the experience of Soviet soldiers who served in Afghanistan. This week, I will move to the other side and take a closer look at their opponents, the Mujahideen, who they were, and how and why they fought. This is The End of History, Part 28. If you grew up in the United States and you're listening to this podcast, it's highly likely that you were steeped in the quasi-mythological story of the American Revolution. If you're not from the United States and you didn't go to school here, you may not realize how central this origin story is to Americans. And if you are American and you went to school here and you haven't engaged in serious academic study of our revolutionary period, you may not realize that outside the United States, the American Revolution is generally considered a relatively minor historical event. It will come as a genuine shock to many of my American listeners that the French Revolution is generally considered to be a much more historically significant event, and that to the extent that our revolution is studied at all, it is usually as a prelude to the much larger conversation about the French Revolution. All that said, America's foundation myth is a big deal in the United States. It's the heroic tale of a plucky band of rebels who made an idealistic stand against a tyrannical king, George III, and with righteousness on their side, they won against all odds, ushering in an age of freedom envied by all the peoples of the globe. Obviously, that's a very simplistic summary, but it is more or less what I was taught in school about my country's founding. And to be honest, that's more or less what I believed as a young man. I still remember the first time I encountered any challenge to this narrative. I was about 18 or 19, and I started watching a British-made documentary on the American War of Independence. It definitely exposed me to a point of view I had not heard before. To be honest, at first my confirmation bias kicked in, and I rejected the information. I actually turned it off and didn't finish watching. What was disturbing about it to me was that it painted the British in a light that made them more relatable to me than the Americans. It made their actions seem not so much tyrannical as, from a certain point of view, downright reasonable. And the Americans, the vaunted Minutemen and the legendary Continental Army, were explicitly compared to the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War and the Mujahideen in the Soviet-Afghan War. It was something that my mind could not grasp at first, that the experience of British soldiers in the Revolutionary War was more similar to that of American soldiers in the Vietnam War, or in the wars that were then ongoing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Don't get me wrong, I still believe there's a lot to admire about America's founding. I love my country, and I think there are a lot of things that make us a great country. My values when it comes to my beliefs of government and society are shaped by the ideals of the American Revolution. But my view of the revolution as a historical event is a lot more nuanced than it used to be. I was reminded of this experience this week as I prepared for this episode, because today I'm going to be talking about the Mujahideen, the Afghan guerrillas who fought the Soviets, who I was once so shocked to hear a British narrator compare to the Minutemen. On the surface, there are a lot of parallels that immediately emerge. Like the Americans in the Revolutionary War, the Mujahideen were the underdog. They lacked the training and equipment of their opponent, and more often than not, when they tried to stand toe-to-toe with them in open battle, they lost. They also won the war not by defeating their enemy, but outlasting them, by making the cost of war in both blood and treasure too high for their enemy to maintain. And I think a lot of Americans probably don't fully realize this, but another parallel is just how critical foreign assistance was to their success. I find it highly unlikely that the Revolutionary War would have ended in an American victory without French support. Likewise, support from the CIA and a coalition of anti-Soviet partners was crucial to the success of the Mujahideen. At the same time, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were not mirror images of the American revolutionaries or other guerrilla movements in history. There were important differences that set them apart as well. For one, their fight was largely motivated by religion. There were some groups that had ideological goals unrelated to religion, but to a man, regardless of which group they belonged to, the thing that unified all of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan was their Islamic faith. They often differed on how they interpreted that faith. Some of them even practiced the minority Shia variety of the faith, but every single faction of the Mujahideen incorporated Islam into its ideology. The Mujahideen were not a unified movement. The groups were deeply factionalized, and though they sometimes cooperated with each other in their fight against the Soviets, they were also rivals. As often as not, they sought to undermine one another, with the more politically Machiavellian Mujahideen leaders focusing as much energy on ensuring their own rise to power after the war as on the prosecution of the war itself. There were almost too many Mujahideen factions to count, with some groups comprised of only a handful of fighters, basically an armed band organized for the defense of a remote village, and others encompassing massive networks with thousands of fighters and operatives in countries all over the world. The largest and most effective of these groups were invariably the ones that were able to secure foreign funding and support. By the mid-1980s, a loose coalition of resistance groups had formed, not due to any shared ideology or vision for the future of Afghanistan, but due to the simple fact that these were the groups that the Pakistani Inter-Service Intelligence, or ISI, had chosen to funnel American and Saudi support to. The role of Pakistan in this story is crucial, as it became the central hub through which foreign support for the Mujahideen flowed into Afghanistan. Pakistan was the glue that held together an alliance of foreign powers every bit as diverse and adverse toward one another as the various Mujahideen factions. The United States, as I mentioned last week, was eager to weaken the Soviet Union and bleed their Cold War adversary dry in Afghanistan, and they were willing to spend money to do it. The CIA would eventually fund billions of dollars into the Soviet-Afghan war. The Saudi royal family, flush with oil money and motivated to defend Islam from the advance of the anti-religious forces of communism, cooperated with the Americans and also sent billions in aid to the Mujahideen. A network of other predominantly Muslim countries also joined the anti-Soviet alliance, though their financial contributions were not as large as Saudi Arabia's. Notably, Egypt was a very important partner in the alliance. The stalwart support of the United States for Israel had opened up an opportunity in the Cold War chess game for the Soviets to undermine their adversary by supporting Israel's enemies. Beginning in the 1950s and continuing through to the mid-1970s, Egypt's military was generously supplied with huge stockpiles of Soviet-made weapons and equipment as a countermeasure to the American equipment provided to Israel. This was terribly important because the United States had no desire to turn the Cold War hot and provoke open confrontation with the Soviets. Therefore, they could not just ship boatloads of American weapons to the Mujahideens in boxes labeled Made in USA. Any weapons given to the Mujahideen had to plausibly appear as though they had originated in the Soviet Union. Even if everybody, including the Soviets, knew where the weapons were really coming from, it was still a vital step in the delicate diplomatic dance of the Cold War for the United States to maintain plausible deniability. That brings me to the next and most improbable partner in the anti-Soviet alliance, Israel. After Egypt, Israel possessed the largest stockpile of Soviet-made weapons in the Middle East, mostly captured from Egypt and Syria in the various wars fought between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The story of how Israel was enlisted as a partner in the jihad against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan is almost stranger than fiction. It's a story that involves cocaine, belly dancers, and one eccentric U.S. congressman from Texas, Charlie Wilson. I cannot do the story full justice here, but those who are interested, I highly recommend that you go read one of my sources for this week's episode, Charlie Wilson's War by George Cryle. Essentially, Congressman Wilson was able to leverage his powerful position on the House Appropriations Committee and personal relationships with the CIA and Israeli government officials to build a secret alliance and finance the war for the Mujahideen. It was the consummate example of the expression, politics make strange bedfellows. Speaking of strange bedfellows, in addition to various European allies, the usual suspects like the UK and France, Communist China also quietly joined the anti-Soviet alliance and funneled money and weapons to the Mujahideen. Their concerns sprang from two main sources. They didn't want the Soviets extending their influence even further into regions of Central Asia that had traditionally fallen within the Chinese sphere, and they bristled at the Soviet Union's claims of hegemony over the communist world, that they essentially proclaimed themselves the sole arbiter of who is a true socialist. I talked about this a little when I talked about the global reaction to the Warsaw Pact invasion in Czechoslovakia. Additionally, though they did not cooperate with the other members of the alliance, at least not openly, Iran also contributed significant sums of money to Mujahideen groups representing Afghanistan's Shia minority. With the exception of Iran, which shared a border with Afghanistan and pretty much did their own thing, all of the support flowing from all of the countries who supported the Mujahideen flowed through Pakistan, specifically through the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI. Having lost their only other strategic ally in the region, Iran, to the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Pakistan was the only country willing and able to facilitate American support for the Mujahideen, as well as the support coming from other members of the global coalition. A simple look at a map will tell you much of the rest of the story. Pakistan shares a long border with Afghanistan, much of it in the remote and mountainous tribal region. That border has always been, and even remains to this day, a porous one, with many people moving freely across it in both directions. The Soviet force in Afghanistan was never large enough to effectively control or even monitor this border, and thus it was the most convenient way for the supplies to make their way into Afghanistan. The Americans especially didn't much care for internal Afghan politics. They really didn't care too much who was getting the weapons as long as they were using them to hurt the Soviets. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, or so the old saying goes. So when the Pakistani ISI conditioned their cooperation on being granted the discretion to decide how to disperse much of the money flowing from the United States, their terms were readily agreed to. The groups that came to receive the bulk of funds from the CIA came to be known as the Peshawar Seven. Most of these groups fell into one of two categories. They were either Islamists, or they were some flavor of Afghan patriot or nationalist. Some funds did make their way to some of the patriotic or nationalist groups, particularly the National Islamic Front of Afghanistan, led by Ahmed Gailani, whose moderate, pro-Western and pro-democracy views made his group a favorite of the Americans. But a disproportionate amount of the money was funneled to more extreme Islamist groups, particularly the faction of Hizb-i-Islami led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, an extreme Islamist who advocated for the most conservative interpretations of Islamic law and advocated for a government based on these extreme principles. While he would later have some of his own personal issues with some Taliban leaders, I think it's fair to say that Hekmatyar is one of the ideological forefathers of the modern Taliban. It is, of course, one of the great ironies of this story that in supporting the most extreme factions of the Mujahideen, the United States funded and inflamed the very ideology that would lead to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, precipitating its own drawn-out war of attrition in Afghanistan. Pakistan had its own motivations in choosing who to support in Afghanistan. You may recall from previous episodes that the Durand Line, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, was drawn by the British in the 19th century, very much against the will of many of the people who lived there. Many of the people on the Pakistani side of that porous border were ethnic Pashtuns, just like the majority of people in the border regions of Afghanistan. The Pakistani ISI was eager to oppose Soviet expansion into the region, but the last thing they wanted to do was inflame Afghan nationalism or awaken any kind of Pashtun national consciousness that called to reunite Pashtun peoples in one state. Giving too much support to a Mujahideen faction focused on Afghan nationalism or patriotism could mean that the groups they were supporting today could turn against them tomorrow. Weapons and fighters could move across that border in either direction. The more extreme Islamist factions, however, were less concerned with ideas of national consciousness or patriotism than they were with implementing their interpretation of Islamic law. The Pakistanis understood that there were potential negative consequences from supporting these groups, but they were fairly confident that it was less likely to blow up directly in their face. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's faction was one of the largest, and it was certainly the most well-funded, but it was actually comparatively ineffective militarily against the Soviets. He was no military genius. though he certainly had some competent guerrilla commanders in his outfit. He seemed to spend at least as much time and energy fighting his fellow Mujahideen as he did the Soviets. He also made no secret of the fact that he hated the West almost as much as he hated the Soviets. He was nonetheless happy to accept support from the United States and even from Israel. During a meeting with Congressman Charlie Wilson in a Peshawar hotel room in January 1984, he was asked by Wilson whether he had a problem accepting aid from the Israelis. Witnesses say he replied with a wide smile, quote, "We take Russian weapons from dead Russians to use against them. I don't see why we can't take them from the Israelis as well. Allah has many mysterious ways of providing for his faithful." End quote. Howard Hart, the CIA station chief in Islamabad, Pakistan, had grave reservations about supporting Hekmatyar, but Congressman Wilson believed the devil's bargain was necessary to defeat the Soviets. Hekmatyar was highly favored by the Pakistani ISI for a variety of reasons, but first and foremost, he had already been an agent of theirs for some time. The Pakistanis insisted on alliance with Hekmatyar, and without the Pakistanis, there could be no war. Hartman relented. Hekmatyar had been working with the ISI since his days at Kabul University, where he joined and came to lead one faction of the anti-Soviet fundamentalist group, Muslim Youth. His faction of the group was notorious for their radicalism and brutality, becoming infamous for throwing acid on women, who they deemed to be insufficiently covered. While at Kabul University, Hekmatyar first met the man who would be his main rival for the next quarter century. Not a communist, but a fellow Islamist, Ahmad Shah Massoud. I think here it's necessary to pause and define my terms. I think a lot of my listeners probably have a certain picture pop into their heads when they hear about Islamists or Islamism, and your mind probably immediately conjures images of Al-Qaeda terrorists or the Taliban. And you're not wrong. Those are both examples of Islamist groups, but the term is actually significantly more nuanced than that. First and foremost, it's not a synonym for the religion of Islam. There are millions of people around the globe who practice Islam and are not Islamists. Islamism specifically refers to a political ideology advocating for a government based on the principles of Islam. But just as there are many interpretations of Islam, there are many different versions of Islamism, and they don't all share the bloodthirsty vision of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and his ilk. Like Hekmatyar, Ahmad Shah Massoud was a devout Sunni Muslim. Also like Hekmatyar, he abhorred communism and believed the salvation of Afghanistan was to be found on a spiritual rather than a secular path. But that's about where the similarities end. Unlike Hekmatyar, who was a Pashtun, Massoud was a Tajik. Initially, at least, their differences probably had as much to do with this as with anything else. As Massoud's ideology developed, the gap widened as he eventually came to reject Hekmatyar's narrow-minded vision of Islamism. He preached a more inclusive and moderate Islamic society. He believed that secular ideas like democracy did not necessarily conflict with an Islamic society. He also believed that there was room for compromise with those who disagreed with him, including Hekmatyar, a belief that on numerous occasions would nearly lead to his downfall. Massoud also believed that the Quran preached the fundamental equality of men and women. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it very explicitly does. But that's not to say he didn't believe in traditional gender roles. He did. And he believed those were mandated by the Quran as well. But unlike Hekmatyar, he believed that within those roles, women were entitled to respect and dignity as the spiritual equal of men. Massoud was also different in how he prosecuted the war against the Soviets. He was firmly against the Soviet Union and the communist ideology they stood for, but he did not express hatred for individual Soviet soldiers. When Soviet prisoners fell into his hands, they were treated with kindness and respect. One Soviet soldier was so enamored with him that he ultimately chose to stay with him, convert to Islam, and join his personal bodyguard. Also unlike Hekmatyar, Massoud was a true military commander. A Renaissance man fluent in several languages, Massoud had studied guerrilla warfare, and was particularly fond of the works of Che Guevara and Mao Zedong on the subject. While the tactics he employed were generally similar to the guerrilla tactics of the other Mujahideen commanders, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, and improvised explosives and booby traps, Massoud is one of the few Mujahideen commanders who could truthfully claim to have also defeated the Soviet forces in open battle. Despite all his merits, Massoud would receive little support from the CIA or the Pakistanis, mainly because he was an enemy of Hekmatyar, who was the favorite of the ISI. He would, however, become the beneficiary of the lion's share of military aid provided by the United Kingdom. Though the British MI6 did not have anywhere near the resources of the American CIA to aid the Mujahideen, the British support that Massoud received was sufficient to fund his operation when combined with equipment captured from the Soviets and the vast network of support he built among the people. And that is the thing that stands out the most about Massoud, the deep support he had among ordinary people. To this day, he is a hero among the Tajiks of Afghanistan, remembered as the Lion of Panjshir. He would go on to become the leader of the Northern Alliance, a coalition of groups that opposed the Taliban throughout the 1990s. He was assassinated by al-Qaeda terrorists posing as journalists on September 9, 2001, just 2 days before the 9/11 attacks. His assassination was likely calculated to eliminate a strong popular leader who was likely to receive American support in the coming war. A third important Mujahideen leader that I want to briefly talk about is Ahmed Gailani. Though his group was not particularly favored by the Pakistani ISI, he was the favorite of the Americans, and support for the National Islamic Front of Afghanistan was the compromise the Pakistanis made with the Americans in order to secure American support for Hekmatyar and his group. The National Islamic Front, known by their acronym NIFA, was the most moderate of the Mujahideen factions that were among the Peshawar Seven. They rejected both communism and Islamism in favor of support for secular government. Their ultimate goal appears to have been the return of Zahir Shah from exile and his restoration to the throne as a constitutional monarch. NIFA was also remarkable in that their official spokesperson was a woman, a relatively westernized woman fluent in both English and French, who the Soviet journalist Artyom Borovik described as incredibly beautiful. Fatima Gailani, the daughter of the leader of NIFA, worked from her exile in London, which made her extremely accessible to Western journalists who wanted to interview a spokesperson from the Afghan resistance groups. This accessibility made her a fixture in Western news programming, as the voice of the Mujahideen, and to many Westerners whose only knowledge of the war in Afghanistan came from the nightly news, she came to embody what they believed the resistance to the Soviet Union was all about. She was moderate, secular, and pro-democratic, a natural ally of the West in their struggle against communism. So too, they thought, must be the Mujahideen movement as a whole. Indeed, despite their relatively small impact in the military sphere, at least when compared to other groups like Hekmatyar's and Massoud's, NIFA had an extremely outsized impact in selling their struggle to Westerners and ensuring that the money continued to flow to their cause from Western countries. In the West, the Mujahideen were invariably portrayed in a heroic light. They were freedom fighters, struggling against the forces of tyranny and unparalleled violence. More than one publication compared them to the Rebel Alliance from Star Wars, a comparison that seemed all the more fitting considering President Reagan's constant reference to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. This heroic portrayal in Western media probably hit its peak with the 1988 Sylvester Stallone action flick Rambo 3, in which the timeless character that is the human killing machine John Rambo travels to Afghanistan to assist the Mujahideen in their struggle against the Soviet Union. The film even closed with a dedication, quote, "This film is dedicated to the gallant people of Afghanistan," end quote. The truth about the Mujahideen is, of course, more complicated. There was heroism and sacrifice to go around. There was also plenty of cruelty and brutality to go around. Mostly, your average mujahid, the singular of the plural mujahideen, was not all that different from the Soviet soldier he was fighting against. They were mostly farmers, but they came from every walk of life. There were doctors, university students, shopkeepers, and every other profession and social class you can think of. Some were wealthy, some were poor. Some were soldiers who defected from the military of the Soviet-backed Afghan regime, but aside from these defectors, few had much in the way of military training or experience. Since there were so many factions and the pool of people who fought in the war was so diverse, it's very difficult to generalize, except to say that they were ordinary people caught up in extraordinary and difficult times. The American journalist Jan Goodwin, a senior editor from Ladies' Home Journal, left behind her cushy job in New York to embed with a group of mujahideen for 3 months in 1986. She wrote an account of this experience published the following year in 1987, called Caught in the Crossfire. In the book, Goodwin detailed how the dire circumstances in Afghanistan led many to believe that they had no choice but to fight. And she had a point. Though some mujahideen were from urban areas, the rank-and-file fighters were disproportionately from the countryside, and especially from the areas near the Pakistani border. As I mentioned last time, the Soviets took the words of Mao quite seriously when he said that the guerrilla must swim among the people like a fish in the sea. This meant that the success of any guerrilla movement relied on the support of the local civilian population, and the Soviets adopted the brutal tactic of intentionally and methodically depopulating large swaths of the countryside by raining down such devastation that the people living there had no choice but to flee or die. Last week, I talked about the Soviet soldiers who served in Afghanistan, and I think I portrayed them in a very sympathetic light, because I do think there's much to empathize with when it comes to the struggle of the common soldier. Even Jan Goodwin remarked upon her first sighting of dead Russian soldiers in Afghanistan whose bodies had been left for scavengers, quote, "I wondered whether their families had yet been informed that they weren't coming home, and I couldn't help thinking that the average Soviet conscript was much like the average American GI in Vietnam, fighting a war he didn't understand in a country he knew little about," end quote. I cannot express the same sympathy for the Soviet High Command, who formulated and prosecuted the Red Army's strategy in Afghanistan. Their methods were calculated to inflict disproportionate suffering on civilians. It is inexcusable, and I think their actions arguably meet the legal definition of genocide. Wakil, one of the mujahideen who Goodwin traveled with, recounted to her what he had seen when his village was attacked by the Soviet helicopters and its population forced to flee on foot to Pakistan as refugees. He recalled one woman in particular, whose suffering he could not forget. Quote, "One mother was sick. She had just given birth to a baby. It was premature because of the bombing terror. She was holding the baby, and she had 2 more children with her. But she could barely walk. She didn't know where she was going or what she was going to do. I looked at her children, and I wanted to put their bare, bleeding feet in my pocket. I wanted to carry them back, but I just stood there. All I could see were women and children leaving, and young men going in. The first group to live, the second probably to die. It was never the reverse. If this keeps up, the country is going to be empty." End quote. On another occasion, as the group she traveled with passed through a village, Goodwin recalled an encounter with a little girl, about 4 or 5, who was stricken with terror at the sight of her. Unable to comprehend what a Western female journalist would be traveling through war-torn Afghanistan for, the little girl apparently concluded that she was a Russian, and was so terrified that she could not be consoled. Her brother had recently lost a leg to a landmine that the locals swore was disguised as a children's toy. A few weeks later, the group passed through the same village. Not seeing the little girl, Jan inquired after her, only to learn that she had been killed in a Soviet airstrike a few days before. The Soviet tactics employed in the Afghan countryside were not only brutal and immoral, but they didn't work, and in fact they backfired. As Goodwin's companion Wakil had suggested, the brutality against civilians only motivated more men to join the jihad and fight with the mujahideen. The Soviets did not have enough troops in Afghanistan to depopulate the countryside entirely, and they learned the hard way that when you take everything away from someone, they will fight as though they have nothing left to lose. And so the war would go. Civilians would suffer and flee, while the young men of Afghanistan marched the other way, towards almost certain death. The Soviets soon awoke to the quagmire they found themselves in. In March 1985, power in the Kremlin passed to a new man, a relatively young and energetic reformer who fancied himself a humanitarian, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev came to power with the intention of ending the war in Afghanistan, and by early 1986, he had concluded that the Red Army would have to withdraw. But he was searching for a way to end the war without a humiliating retreat. A way to achieve what has been referred to in the context of various American foreign wars as peace with honor. It is exactly the same conundrum that multiple American presidents found themselves in with regard to the debacle in Vietnam. They knew there was no outright victory to be had, but they could not find a way out without suffering a humiliating defeat. By mid-1986, however, the worst of the Soviet atrocities in Afghanistan had at least subsided, as the new government sought to stop making the problem worse while they looked for a way to make it better. Gorbachev was the fourth man to serve as General Secretary in 3 years. The country he took over was already in the midst of a deepening economic crisis. He had big plans on what he was going to do to fix it, but the ongoing Afghan quagmire was a constant thorn in the side of those plans. It took him 3 years, but Gorbachev ultimately was able to find a way out of Afghanistan. There was enough of a diplomatic agreement with the Western powers and with Pakistan that he could tell his people it was a negotiated ending. But neutral observers all saw it for what it was, a catastrophic defeat. In February 1989, the last contingents of Red Army soldiers crossed the Amu Darya River back into the Soviet Union, leaving Afghanistan to its fate. The communist government of Afghanistan held out against the Mujahideen for 3 more years, finally collapsing in 1992. What followed was a long civil war between the competing factions of Mujahideen. The Mujahideen factions continued to bleed each other dry, leaving a power vacuum open for a new movement, composed of some of the most radical former Mujahideen fighters, to sweep in and take power. They called themselves the Students, Taliban in Pashto. They would capture Kabul in 1996 and ultimately control about 80% of the country, though the bloodletting would continue, as Ahmad Shah Massoud and his Northern Alliance continued to resist them from the Panjshir Valley. I would love to cover the story of modern Afghanistan more thoroughly in this podcast one day, but for now, that is where I'm going to leave them. The country that the Soviet soldiers returned to in 1989 had gone through profound changes since the war in Afghanistan started a decade earlier. And when I return next time, I will roll the clock back to the early 1980s and begin to talk about those changes. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, I want to give a big thank you and shout out to my patrons and supporters who support the show with monthly donations through Spotify and Patreon. You're my heroes, and I couldn't do this without you. If you're not supporting the show yet, and you want to, you can support us with a monthly donation on Spotify or Patreon. Links to both can be found on my show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. On that website, you will also find links to all of my streaming platforms, social media pages, and a list of my sources for this week's episode. That website again is www.thehistorysphere.com. If you haven't already, I encourage you to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening on. It costs you nothing, and it really helps to promote the podcast in the algorithm so that it can be introduced to new listeners. It also helps me out if you tell your friends about the show and encourage them to listen. Next time on The History Sphere, I will talk about the death of Leonid Brezhnev and the struggle for power in the Kremlin that followed. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.